So how are you dealing with the temptation of staying where you are? You see, if evil can get you to be okay with your teenager just being a good kid, then evil knows it doesn't have to worry about you getting on your knees, mom and dad, and praying for your teenager to be radically transformed and on fire for Jesus Christ. How are you dealing with the temptation to stay where you are? I mean, if evil can just get you to stay in your comfort zone, then it doesn't have to worry about you venturing out to the places where God could really use you. Because He always uses us where we're weak, rarely where we're strong. How are you dealing with the temptation to stay where you are? I mean, if evil can get you to be okay with being okay, then evil's okay with you being okay. Because as long as you're just okay, as long as you're just dealing with the pain, as long as you're just learning how to cope with your character defects, evil never has to worry about Christ setting you free. You with me? You see, how are you dealing with the temptation of staying where you are? Because if evil can convince a married couple just to get comfortable with coexisting and each one living their own lives, then evil knows it doesn't have to worry about that married couple ever being the soulmates that God destined you to be. It doesn't have to worry about that. If evil can convince us that all prayer does is make us feel a little better, then evil knows that it is won. Because he doesn't have to worry about a church of people getting on their knees and saying, Jesus said, if I say this mountain must move, it must move, and believing it to move. Evil doesn't have to worry about that. All you believe is prayer to make you feel a little better. How are you dealing with the temptation to stay where you are? Because if evil can get us to see church as simply an hour on Sunday, then evil will say, go ahead and go to church. Evil will say, go ahead and do your little spiritual thing once a week for an hour. Because hell is not threatened by churchgoers. Hell is threatened by church-beers. Amen? So I want to ask you on this first Sunday in this new building, I think it's a good time for us to ask this question and settle it once and for all for us as Living Hope Church. How are we going to deal with the temptation to stay where we are? How are we going to deal with the temptation to stay where we've always been? Because you see, no church ever wakes up one day and says, let's be ineffective and ingrown and lifeless. But every church that becomes ineffective and ingrown and lifeless is because there's a people and there's a pastor who say, let's just stay where we are. This feels good. Let's pitch a tent and let's just camp here for a while. Let's stay where we've always been. After all, we've always done it that way. Let's just kind of pitch a tent and stay here. And the church tries to gain control from God. And the church tries to hang on to their prized possessions as though they're theirs instead of God's. Are you with me? And the church tries to say, this is about us, and it's kind of about Him. And we forget why we're here. I think that you have in you this spirit that overcomes the temptation to stay where you are. I'll never forget a year and a half ago walking into a church board meeting and saying, okay, here's the deal. We know we have to make more room for more people. We know that, and here's the choices. We can either build here or we can go buy 1150 Spring Valley Pike where they have more land and more parking and more space than what we can ever build here. But here's the catch, board. We don't have money to do either one. So what do you choose? And they raise their hands and unanimously and says, we choose to move. And then I was a nervous wreck. My stomach was sick the first Sunday when they said, now you go tell the church. And I stood up before you and I said, listen, we can either build here for less, for the same amount of money, or we can move there and get more. What do you want to do? And you all are nuts. Unanimously, you said, let's move. And I had even told you we don't have the money to do it. And you said, let's move. I thought for sure you would say, you're insane. Let's get a new pastor. There's our vote. He lost his mind. And then we threw you the clincher. There's just one more thing, and we did tell you this before you voted. We said you have to raise $180,000 in 3 weeks, which I think I'm right in saying is about over half of our annual giving for a year. 3 weeks, that's not too much to ask, is it? 3 weeks, you have to raise $180,000. And I'll never forget that Sunday morning I was sitting on the front row and John Colgrove and Gary Hurst stood up and announced, and they said, we didn't raise $180,000. You raised over $300,000. Praise God. you. I share that with you because I want to encourage you today. If ever there was a time when we must decide that we will continue to have a spirit that overcomes the temptation not to stay where we are, it is now. Because churches get into a new place and they get into a new building, and all of a sudden people get nervous and they start holding on to things that aren't theirs. And all of a sudden they start saying, well, we can't feed the children of Centerville. I mean, somebody else is going to have to feed them because we got this big building to take care of. And we can't send people to Honduras. We can't send people to West Virginia and minister to the needs there because we got this stuff here. I mean, we got to hang on to this stuff. What if we lose it? You see, we can't go and start an after-school program for low-income children in our community because we got this big building. We got to pay the bills, Chad. We've got to make things happen here. I mean, we've got to hang on to what we have. Friends, I tell you, I would rather us foreclose on this building and go pitch that stupid tent and meet in it than us to lose our vision for Christ in our community. Amen. This is a great gift from God. We give credit to who credit is due. It's not just because of any one person. It's not because of some pastor. It's because of Him. And we recognize that. But this building, God doesn't need it to be able to serve the needs of others. God doesn't need it to be able to transform lives. He has given it as a gift for us to use for Him. But the goal has not been accomplished by renting this building. The goal is to reach out and get outside of ourselves and never be satisfied with staying where we are or where we've always been until we see one more person know Jesus Christ in a way in which their lives are forever changed. Amen? Amen. So we must ask ourselves how we're going to deal with this temptation. And I love how Jesus responds. Peter says, Jesus, you want us just to pitch a tent and stay here? I mean, this is good. Jesus doesn't say a word. Verse 9. Jesus speaks with His actions. Listen to this. As they were coming down the mountain. I love that. I love how Jesus works. Peter's saying, you want me to build something? You want to stay here? This is good. This is comfortable. This is safe. Let's stay here. And Jesus says, He doesn't say a word. So He shows him, we're going to be a people that keep on moving. Peter, if you want to stay in tune with me, then you can't stop here. You've got to keep following where I lead. Are you with me? You see, if we're going to overcome the temptation in our personal lives and in our church, then we must be a people who say, if I say I want to stay where I am, if I say I want to stay where I've always been, then that is my way of saying, Jesus, go on without me. You hear me? Does that make sense? If I insist, and God will let us, if I insist to stay in my pain, if I insist to stay in my preferences, if I insist to stay over here and not serve anybody, Jesus will let me build a tent and stay there. But understand, He's moving on. And if I'm going to follow Him, I've got to keep these feet of mine moving. Because He's always taken me someplace new. I don't care how long you've served Christ. It doesn't matter how spiritual you think you are. Jesus has more room for you to grow. Amen? There's always someplace new to go. And Peter didn't stop. And you know what Peter saw because he didn't stop? He saw blind eyes open. He saw sick people made well. He saw the rejected accepted by Christ. He saw the judged handed out mercy by Jesus. He saw the excluded embraced. He saw 5,000 people fed with a few loaves of bread and fish. He saw a dead man alive again. Because Peter's kept following Jesus, even though he had denied Christ, when Jesus needed the most, Jesus called him over and said, hey, you know what? You're forgiven, feed my sheep. And on one sermon, he watched 3,000 people accept Jesus Christ into their lives. One day, Peter would have never gotten to see that and more had he ever stopped following Jesus. Had he ever pitched that tent and said, let's just stay here. Church, individual Christian, you want to see great things in your life, in your family's life. You want to see God touch a community and a country and a world by a little church in Centerville? You say He can't do that. Then you need to go someplace else, because we are people who believes He can. Amen. We are people who believes He will. But we've got to overcome the temptation. We've got to keep walking